Hey guys, it's me. So I've said I would make this video a while ago, and I haven't uploaded it for quite a while. And I'm going to explain it why for people who haven't seen my Twitter. So basically, it's hard for me to do everything from my phone. I do not have a computer with me. I don't have a computer at all whatsoever. So I'm having to record it through my voice memos and then put it onto iMovie and then clip out some stuff that I made a mistake on. This part isn't scripted, but when I explain the whole my life story thing, all that is scripted. Alright, so let's begin. I was born on May 12th, 2000 in Odessa, Texas. And that is when baby me was born. I was raised with around computers since I'd always hang around my dad's own computer business called Computron, which is no longer in business. My first ever gaming console was when I was 3. It was the PlayStation 2. And the first ever games I played was Crash 1, Crash Cortex Strikes Back, Crash Warped, Crash the Wrath of Cortex, and one of my personal favorites, iNinja. On May 13th of 2003, my brother Andrew was born. On November 5th of 2004, my brother Sean was born. I got to play on my first computer, which was my dad's PC when I was 4. Bejeweled was always my favorite game I'd play on his lap. We moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin in 2005, and my mom and dad had a lot of heated arguments while I'd peek out of the cracked door of my room. And my mom would always get in trouble for the littlest of things, like something as simple as me getting a mosquito bite. Yeah, it was pretty dumb. A few months later, news broke out to the family that my great-grandpa had passed away in his sleep, and I was traumatized to hear that he would never come back, and it tore my heart to shreds, and took me quite a long time to accept that he was gone. He was the only best friend that I had at the time, and he'd always call me his main man. Because of him, I had an addiction to coffee and a love for Western films. And according to my mom, he said he always felt like I was going to be gay, like it was my destiny or something. But we'll get to that topic later. Later that same year of 2005, my mom and dad broke apart and had shared child custody schedules for my brothers and I. It wasn't fun at all, and was an awful year for all of us. In 2006, I went to Southern Bluffs Elementary where I started school, and it was great. I had a blast. Made some friends. Well, only 3. But we were like a pack. They were all girls, and I had a hard time making friends with guys because of the feelings I had towards them. I didn't have those feelings towards girls at all, so it was easier for me to become friends with girls. Plus, it made me learn more about myself that I didn't even know about, and I became really shy and feminine in school. 2007, I had my first guy friend named Jeremiah. He was cool, and he and I liked Star Wars, Marvel, DC, and other cool stuff. We'd have sleepovers from time to time and play Lego Star Wars, Mario Kart, and even Kirby on our Nintendo DS's. Yeah, I was a cool kid back then, not really. When I'd come home from school, however, things weren't the same. It was like school and sleepovers were my getaway from family issues. When it came to things like not being man enough or tough enough, my dad would always slap me and call me a sissy for being feminine and fragile. Then a day later, quote unquote, apologizing by purchasing a gift, expensive or not. But this would always be a loop, and gifts being purchased felt more like an excuse to shove things under the rug rather than being a genuine apology. But at the time, I thought that was what fatherly love was like. And with him saying, and I quote, "I only hit you because I love you." In 2008, my dad took my brothers and I to Disney World for the very first time ever. And it was a complete mess of a time. We were forced to go on rides we didn't want to go on. We all got heat sick. Our stomachs ached like hell. We threw up a lot, and it overall wasn't pleasant. It felt like he was trying to bond with us, but in every wrong way possible. There were very few things on that trip that I cherished, which was during the nights when all the gloomy lights of the lanterns would light up in the Pirates of the Caribbean area, the amazing seafood restaurants, and the rides that didn't make me feel sick to my stomach and scared out of my mind. In other words, I do not like heights. The years from there on forth have all been the same, until it came to January 2010, and that's when everything changed. I got a call into the principal's office for the very first time ever, and I was always the good kid in school, and being called in made me scared out of my mind as I thought I did something wrong. When I entered the office, I saw my mom and the principal sitting down with a newspaper on the page of an article. The principal was in tears, and my mom was in tears because of how bad they had felt for knowing what I was about to hear. They broke the news to me that my dad had been arrested during work at City Hall for smuggling and hiding cash from Mexico to Texas to Wisconsin. In other words, being a fraud. I bursted into tears seeing how long they'd put him in prison, and it was only originally for 20 to 30 years, but then pushed down to only 7 years. I felt so angry at him for being lied to and throughout my life, and could never forgive him for both how he treated me and for not being able to trust him anymore. In that same year, we lived with our mom, and things were a lot different. We couldn't go to Southern Bluffs Elementary anymore because my mom couldn't afford it. We were poor and had to live off very little food stamps. Later that same year of 2010, my aunt and uncle from my dad's side of the family came down to visit and asked my mom for permission to take us to Texas to spend time with them for a week and to visit our dad in prison. My mom agreed, and my brothers and I had a vacation trip to Texas with our aunt and uncle. When we were in Texas visiting our dad, I couldn't help but cry, and he cried behind the glass panel as well. We picked up the phone and got to call each other and had short discussions to catch up on things. Before we had to go, he promised he'd always write letters and never stop until he sees us again. But that was also a lie, and he stopped sending letters and stopped responding to the countless letters my brothers and I have sent him 4 months later. From there on forth, we haven't heard anything from him or his status on anything at all since. I just assumed he stopped caring and started his life over. He knew we were alive and where we lived, but he chose to stop talking to us. On our way home to Wisconsin, my uncle gave me a gift to keep in touch with him and my aunt. It was a small 11-inch Windows 7 Toshiba laptop. He helped set it up for me and set Skype up, and we did a test call. It was pretty cool. At that point, I'd never seen a computer that was small enough for me, and I could take it anywhere I want. Later that same year of 2010, thanks to the internet connection my uncle said he'd pay for to leave the internet bill off my mom's shoulder, I was able to discover myself and what I like to do. I discovered that I like bringing my stories and imagination to life through video games. So I found a game making program that was highly recommended at the time, the original Game Maker. I loved it. I made a whole bunch of Mario fan games and even a Smash Brothers fan game, and they were personal and never went up online, but I'd always make something new for my brothers and I to play, so we wouldn't have to buy games since we were poor. The food we eat was mostly made of bread and pastries, basically homemade bread from flour and stuff, and fish every now and then on rare occasions, but that's all we'd eat. My mom would have to get creative on how the pastries were made, so it didn't seem like we were eating the same thing every single day. Sometimes one morning for breakfast, we'd have chocolate-filled pastries. For lunch, we'd have sandwich meat stuffed pastry, and for dinner, we'd have another pastry or rarely fish. The fish we'd get from a friend of my mom's who owns a farm. She was always nice and helped us with food, sometimes when she could, mostly when she was available. In 2011, it got to the point where she couldn't afford to pay the bills anymore, and we ended up losing our apartment. My mom then called my grandparents for help, and they came over to pick us up all the way from Louisiana to Wisconsin. We lived with our grandparents in Louisiana from 2011 to 2017. but we'll get to that later. In 2012, things were looking up, and things at our grandparents' were great. We have lots of different varieties of food, different beverages, and I still got to make games as my hobby. And that was the same year I discovered the first horror game I have ever witnessed, the game that got me into horror in the first place, Slender the Eight Pages and Amnesia: The Dark Descent. In that same year, I went to middle school, and it was nerve-wracking. I only made one friend. His name was Jesus. We both liked horror, both had a vision for film directing, story writing. We became something we'd call the Film Bros. Yeah, I know, it's a pretty dumb name. We had crazy imaginations on what movie ideas we'd have, and it was pretty awesome. Later on in the school year, I made a couple more friends, and we'd incorporate them into our comic stories we'd write in school. It was a horror humor based comic story we'd call Tyler and Jesus and the Journey to Skeleton. During that same year, I was experiencing some attraction towards Jesus, since I was gay for pretty much all my life and had feelings for him. I would start to get nervous around him ever since, and it would make it harder for me to carry conversations. A few months later, in the same year of 2012, I came out to him and talked about my sexuality, telling him I had feelings for him and hoped he'd understand. He never spoke to me again the night during the phone call when I was home after school. I was scared out of my mind and didn't want to lose him as a friend. The next day, kids gave me a strange look, and it made me feel very uncomfortable. It wasn't until later that a friend of mine came up to me and sat beside me during lunch and asked if I was gay. I said yes and asked who told him. He then responded with something I didn't want to hear. It wasn't... The school knows because Jesus told people, and it spread like a virus. The friend I spoke to during lunch, however, didn't mind I was gay and accepted me for who I was. Everybody else, however, spoke behind my back, whispered about me, asked me rude questions, and it got to the point the principal and the teachers found out, and I was later called into the principal's office. The principal asked if I was alright and told me it wasn't normal for me to have these sort of attractions, and that they called my mom up. And as soon as my mom arrived to the principal's office, they sat her down and discussed a possible solution to all of this was to take me to therapy. My mom, of course, was disgusted of how homophobic the entire school was and got into a massive fight with the principal. She then pulled me out of school, and my mom was crying on the way home, asking me a bunch of questions like, am I alright? Is there anything she could do to make it up for everything that happened to me today? From this day forward, I no longer went to public or even private schools ever again. It made me happy that I was getting a special schooling instead of, which was being homeschooled. And I was happy to know that my mom supported me for my sexuality. Her way of homeschooling me was to get straight to the point instead of teaching pointless algebra and pointless tests that I'll never even use in the future, since we as human beings use basic math like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division on a day-to-day basis. And besides, every day is pretty much a new learning experience whether we notice it or not. She asked what it is I wanted to do with my life, and I said I want to bring my stories and imagination to life through filmmaking and game making. So she helped me start my career up early instead of waiting to start it late in my 30s or 40s. During 2012, I forced myself to become straight ever since the incident at school, and became more and more depressed and unhappy with myself. I knew I was being somebody I wasn't, but I didn't want anybody to hurt me anymore because of who I was. As months went by, I had tried to attempt suicide on several occasions, such as stabbing myself in the chest in the closet, walking into ongoing traffic, and cutting myself. Luckily, I didn't get hurt during any of those attempts because I chickened out and knew I had some greater purpose in life waiting for me. So to cope with my depression, I developed a very bad case of trichotillomania and had a very bad habit of pulling my hair out. During the rest of 2012, I wrote my own imaginative and expressive stories. I had a lot of them, and they were all really weird, and I liked them. They were satisfying, and I really appreciated them. In 2013, my mom took me to the Louisiana Film Festival and film classes to learn the art of cinematography and storytelling, so I can make even more deeper stories and improve on how to approach scenes, trailers, acting, and story writing as a whole. On Christmas of 2013, my mom got me a 15-inch Windows 8 Toshiba laptop and a Games Factory 2. I didn't start making games on it though, as I was so deep into story writing at the time and took film classes that I didn't have time to make games just yet. However, on September of 2014, I was finally ready to take game dev seriously as a career instead of a hobby, and finally opened up the Games Factory 2. And that was the beginning of my first public experimental project, FNAF 3 fan game. On December 23rd of 2014, the game was finished. It was a game I made for fun and was never meant to be taken seriously, as it was my first ever public experimental game I've ever released. And it was scary releasing a game for the first time. In the first 5 hours, it blew up like crazy, and I didn't see it coming. My email kept blowing up with GameJolt reports about this person followed your game, this person followed your game, this person rated your game, this person commented here and there, and YouTubers all over played it, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, there was this huge unnecessary drama about the character I had used without permission in my experimental game. I was only 14 at the time and didn't know any better, and it was my first time getting a taste of what being a game developer was like in the public. And after removing the character and apologizing, I still have received massive amounts of death threats telling me to go kill myself and that I should have never existed to begin with, and that added on to the depression I already had at the time, and it made it even worse. And there was a huge group of people supporting me as well, hoping that I'd get better from all that was going on. And then I then get an email from Scott Cawthon himself saying that I needed to remove the game from GameJolt because he's been getting reports that it was an exact pirated copy of FNAF 1 online. As so, I did what I was told and removed it, and left the internet and just sobbed and lost all motivation to even pursue my dreams. My mom supported me in every step, every way she could, and couldn't bear seeing me in the state I was in. She then contacted Scott about the game not being a pirated copy, and that it was a fan game I made from scratch using his assets as a way to teach myself how to use a ClickTeam game program. Scott then later replied asking for the game file. Later saying he sat down and played the game for himself and realized he was wrong, and he apologized for the misunderstanding. My mom later explained all that I went through with him, from the massive amounts of death threats to the hair pulling, to how long I've been in a depressive state, to how much time I've put into making this experimental project. Scott suggested I rename the project from FNAF 3 Fan Game to something else so that people wouldn't confuse it for the actual FNAF 3 that was still in development. So that's when TRTF had come to mind, and he liked the new name. Scott also wanted to do something special to help me pursue and build my career, and so he asked my mom if I had Fusion 2.5 because he wanted to send me a copy. But my mom replied that she had already bought me that for Christmas of 2014. Then Scott had something else in mind that both my mom and I were oblivious to. He asked my mom for our address to ship a package. So she sent him our address to my grandparents' house that we were living in at the time, and he said to expect a package in the mail soon. I was curious of what he had sent. Um, he then said during the email that I was on his VIP list and that I would be getting early access to FNAF 3 as soon as it gets out to the other VIP members. And I was pretty stoked and excited. A couple weeks later, on January of 2015, I got a gift in the mail. There were FNAF merch that weren't even publicly official yet. There were FNAF stickers, two FNAF t-shirts that were way too big for me and are still too big to this day, and a letter from Scott with a Freddy head doodled on it saying that there was something on the back of the letter and to give it to my mom to help me set it up to help build my career. We looked towards the back of the letter, and it was a $10,000 check. Both my mom and I were shocked and in tears when we saw this, and I was so grateful with how long and far he had gone to show his support for me. He even put it up on his website to be supportive and kind to one another in the community just because of me. My mom then helped deliver the check into the bank, and I used the $10,000 Scott gave me to help build my career and bought a beastly Asus Republic of Gamers laptop, built multiple monitors for multitasking, and a keyboard and mouse for a good headset, 32 gigabytes of RAM upgrade for the laptop, the developer upgrade for Fusion 2.5, and multiple exporters, leaving me with about $3,000 left over. And with the rest of the $3,000, I've donated it to a charitable cause. The page was put back on GameJolt, now called The Return to Freddy's, and more broken than ever. It's crazy how removing one character can affect the entirety of a game. In February of 2015, people all over who supported me were wondering when my next project was going to be made and were asking about a possible TRTF 2. I then thought at this point I should take my experimental project seriously and make a story out of it. So I did. I had some wicked ideas in mind and some original characters like the mysterious figure with the black hat and had no name at the time. Spoiler alert, it became what we know as Lockjaw today later on. But there was one problem. I was still a beginner with Fusion 2.5, and even if I were to attempt to take the project in an entirely different direction, it wouldn't be good because of how unpolished and full of bugs it would have been. So I decided to build off of Scott's story and made my own thing out of it to start out with until I was ready to take such huge steps with the story. During TRTF 2's development, I met my first girlfriend that I forced myself into. It was me basically trying to feel accepted rather than just being myself and accepting myself. She had a character that she asked if she could make, and I did. I then asked if she wanted her OC to be in the game, and she said yes, of course. Hence, TRTF 2 was born. TRTF 2 blew up, and I was starting to have this itch of an addiction to keep working. People wanted a TRTF 3, so I did so. During March of 2015, I started development on The Return to Freddy's 3, and it was meant to put the final nail in the coffin, but I noticed a character that both disturbed and interested people, which was the green dude named Gron. He had little to no explanation behind his existence at the time. All people knew is that he was supposedly messed up. About a month later, I created a dev team called Sabani Games. It was meant as a startup for a potential future company once I'm older and wiser enough to run one, because the legal age to run a business is 18 plus. I was the head of it, and it was my first time running something with a group of people, and it was okay for a while. The only thing I did wrong was hire friends, only because they were friends. That's not how business works, as it should be people who would actually do their job and are good at it. Not saying that they weren't, but there wasn't a whole lot of productivity. after TRTF 3, I was originally going to start on my own original project with the dev team called Lucid. However, the audience grew as months went by and people wanted more and more, so I pushed Lucid aside for another time and worked on TRTF 4. Everybody was excited but me and a few fans who were actually looking forward to my own original project. But all I knew at the time was how to please rather than doing something I wanted to both satisfy myself and an audience who will actually like something new for once. A few weeks into development, TRTF 4 was leaked. I've never dealt with leaks before, as I was still learning how to grow wiser and stronger as a public game developer. I felt so pressured that I rushed the game's final product and released an unfinished game that was supposed to be released on December 24th of 2015 to celebrate TRTF's first anniversary, but was instead released in May, months earlier than what I had originally intended. After TRTF 4 had released, people still liked it no matter how much I rushed it during the leak. But at the time, 3 was the highest rated in the series for its disturbing atmosphere and how it was the largest game in the series, flowing with the most Easter eggs I've ever added in the game. Just a disclaimer, by the way, this is not scripted. I do want to point this out, though, before I read further on, that I'm not claiming whatsoever that TRTF still stands to where it is to this day. I am claiming facts to how they were back then at the time, during the OG era of fan games. Not nowadays. There's obviously a lot more better fan games than during the Freddy's. And I've seen that through my friends. I don't play fan games. I used to back then during live streams, but I haven't ever since I left making fan games. But yeah, that little disclaimer. Don't think I'm claiming that's how the current status of it is now. I'm claiming the facts of how they were at the time back then during the OG era. Alright. Anyways, reading on. A few weeks afterwards, drama went on in Sabani Games because of the new guy I hired, whose name shall not be called. It has caused me to leave the team. After I left, I handed the keys, it's a figure of speech, to a close friend of mine whom I've been friends with for a very long time, Nathan, or in other words, Red Essence 5. Afterwards, the team completely died. This is why you don't hire friends just because they're your friends. Some of them didn't get along or come down to an agreement a lot. It was a total mess. But with all mistakes, we pick up the pieces and we learn from it to avoid it in the future. The best thing about this whole thing is that at least it wasn't a legally registered company. I wasn't ready, nor was I of age to run one. But it's definitely taught me a lot and what to avoid next time, which I'll get to my second attempt later in the video. I've announced TRTF 4 as my last game in the series and went more in depth into Gron's origin, but it still didn't explain his morals, how he got into the mental state he was in, etc. It wasn't enough to satisfy the audience, so TRTF 4 was born. And it was meant to originally remaster TRTF 1, or what people like to call TRTF Classic. But I've decided that if I'm going to make another TRTF, I'm going to do it my way, and not the traditional way. I wanted to show what my imagination and creativity was capable of creating, and how far I can go with it, with story and everything else. So TRTF R became a remaster to a reboot. But it was so directly connected to the original 4 games that it didn't feel like a reboot. So I changed it to TRTF 5. I wanted to do something different instead of what everybody else was doing. I didn't want to be stuck in one area, I wanted to move. But not with WASD, by clicking. And I wanted the player to see them walk to another area in the room, not teleport. I wanted them to be able to hide behind crates, under tables and beds, in closets. I wanted the player to be able to have flashlights with limited batteries. I wanted the player to have night vision goggles. I wanted the player to feel paranoid, so I implemented a system where if you keep your flashlight on for too long, the monsters would see the light and eventually find you. But if you keep it off for too long, Linda, Gron's dead wife, would be able to be summoned and kill you with flesh-eating robotic rats that scamper on the ground and crawl on the screen. I wanted players to be able to solve puzzles, riddles, clues, and codes through notes that you can find and collect throughout the entirety of the factory. I wanted an inventory system where you can go back and look over what you have collected and possibly, quite possibly, use items you never knew you could use to progress through the game. I wanted flashback scenes. I wanted voiceovers with the animatronics and player. I wanted Allison to antagonize the player throughout the game, mocking him and making him/her believe that they can't beat the game and lose faith in themselves. I wanted tapes you can listen to throughout the game to listen to the past and what had happened and caused all the chaos throughout the franchise's lore. I wanted TRT 5 to not only be the end of the timeline, but also tell an origin story, while also remaining in the present and not the past. And TRT 5 gave birth to a new series I'd call Volume 2. TRT 1 through 4 were labeled Volume 1. Volume 2 was basically me doing what I want with the series. Kind of. I'll explain more later on why I say kind of. People digged the concept behind Volume 2 and how I wanted to do something entirely different than what everybody else was doing, which made them obsessed, and not in the good way either. I'll explain that later. Months later, in October of 2015, I started a project called A Story. It was not that fun to make, and I'll explain why it was cancelled. The game was more or less copying the beginner's guide, but with twists of my own and some inserted original material, such as teaching the player the basics of creating a game with simple puzzles and whatnot. It was also greenlit on Steam, but the game made me feel genuinely sick to my stomach because of the story it was telling. I didn't feel comfortable with telling it at all whatsoever. It wasn't a fictional story, as the story it was telling is the one I'm telling right now. I wasn't comfortable at all with telling my experiences to relate to certain audiences, so that they know that they are not alone in situations like these, and that the game can help guide them through the struggles of childhood memories, being a game dev and dealing with popularity, how to avoid situations for the betterment of your public image, etc. I didn't want to relive anything, but here I am. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? But this feels like the right thing to do in my heart, which is why I made this video. I have good intentions when it comes to canceling projects, and I've only canceled this one and one other, which I'll get to later on in this video. A month later, around November, somebody who shall not be named and I started a TRTF spin-off project called Frankberts. And yes, I was still working on TRTF 5 at this time too. The plot was you play as a criminal who works for Allison, but not only working under him directly, but because he's somewhere between the walls of Hasbro Incorporated, but you work for a henchman who is like a second in command for Allison pretty much. And he runs a small low-cover criminal institute disguised itself as a closed-down children's play area, so that nobody would notice any suspicious activity going on in such an innocent-looking place. There were adult matter in it, yes, but they were never shown in the camera view, ever. They were never going to, at least because we never added that yet, as I wouldn't go that far. It does get mentioned as you are a new recruit for the gang and in need of a tour around the place and what everything is and how everything works. I had other plans in mind that I left oblivious, and the person I was working with didn't like the quote-unquote shift in plans, when in reality the situation was we had creative differences. I like to be obscure, deceiving, vague, and become a wild card when it comes to my projects, and he didn't like that. At least my company and I run is full of that, and they love to find out secrets, even if it's kept from one dev to another. It makes the game dev experience so much more fun and exciting and interesting for us. Hell, I even keep some development plans from the devs to keep it vague. Ignorance is bliss for us all in the studio. When one dev doesn't know what's going on with his/her fellow colleagues' game, it can be fun and exciting for us all to figure out eventually or come to the realization of it. It's chaotic, yes, but a good kind of chaotic for us that we as a studio love. That's ahead in the future, and we'll get to that later. Anyways, the project Frankfurt's was still in development under me since the guy I was working with didn't like how I work and how vague I am on my projects, which is fine. Not everybody will like everything, not even surprises. A few weeks later in the same month, after Volume 2 was in the middle phase of development, TRTF 5 ran into what is called a RAM limit, where I can no longer add any more to the game without using any more RAM, without it using any more RAM than it can handle, therefore breaking the game. I had to compromise and went into completely redoing the gameplay. All the other stuff stayed. It was the exact opposite from what I wanted, but close. I wasn't happy with it, so I began to seek a friend for help who knows how to modify code and program with Python. He modified the Fusion 2.5's engine files for me, and it allowed me to do more and go further than the original RAM limit. I could finally do all the point and click free roam and whatnot, and it was still directly tied to the Return of Freddy's. Having it shackled to FNAF limited what I could do with the lore. I wanted TRTF to be TRTF and not FNAF. And having animatronics in the game with the plot tied directly to Volume 1 didn't help my needs any. So I implemented frames that were inaccessible and only found in the game's MFA files. That's Fusion's game file name for those who are new to this kind of stuff. During February of 2016, I announced that I was handing the franchise off to and I quote, close friend of mine, that the franchise is now in his hands, end quote. And it really was. I wasn't lying. The franchise really was in his hands, and I'll explain that right now. His supposed name was Yinko Yu, and he's a made-up fictional character that played a huge role in the old TRTF series, starting with TRTF 5. That shifted the past events of the timeline to benefit the new future to provide a shifted reality full of all things new, but uncannily similar in several ways. This has peeped up some drama of me supposedly making a false identity when the reality of the situation was he's a fake video game character used for the purpose of one gigantic ARG experience for the audience to interact with. They not only use the game to solve the lore and other mysteries, but they also use social media aspects as a whole to connect dots linked to real-world stuff that they can interact with instead of just the video game alone. In other words, an IRG. That's what Volume 2 was, one giant mind game. During Volume 2's era of development, there were teasers put up saying not everything is what it seems, or because things really aren't what they seem. And sooner after that, another teaser saying, you've been played, because the audience really is being played with. It's my way of interacting with my audience. It's just how I work. You can't trust anything I say or do when it comes to game development. You need to take everything with a grain of salt because it could be the exact opposite of what you expect, or even just a little bit close to what you expect, but still the opposite. And there will be more to it than you think at first sight, which there is a point I'm trying to prove, which I'll explain later in the video. After mysterious and obscure implementations of frames that were never seen before in the game but had no answer to, like the boss fight, where the player has to fight me in the center of space and time on a holographic grid, that location is the multiversal wormhole. That is where 4 gates to 4 worlds are in the old reality. The ending where you see the Fedora kid being talked to from what seems like Shadow Lockjaw at first, but if you've noticed, I put gray joints in between the robotic characters and left it fluent for organic characters. So for the organic character sprites, there are no joints. The Lockjaw in that particular frame and one other frame, which is in direct reference to Tier 5 Trailer 2's Trailer 2, is fluent. The sprite is fluent. Has black smoke and has black smoke like swirly ooze, which is the lockjaw that we see today for The Road That Falls. If you've seen my Instagram and concept art on there, aka the new Tier TF. But we'll get to that later. Back to 2016. The main prologue screen when you start the game up for the first time, the player is introduced to the narrator of the story. That's Allison telling you who you quote unquote supposedly play as, and telling you about your lucid dreams you've been having. But the story he tells about you doesn't match up at all with your character's backstory. Yeah, one piece matches up with Gron, but that's it. There are too many red flags put in place until now. The description of the new character, James Califron, matches up with the story Allison's been telling perfectly, because James is from the new reality dealing with these exact issues that Allison is explaining. Having these lucid dreams from the old shattered timeline that no longer exists, and being traumatized of something that happened to him in '96. This wasn't completely put together properly, however, until August of 2017, though, during the beginning of The Road That Falls' development, because the intention behind the story Allison was telling was to help support a possible future reboot. There's also the fake prologue frame where you play as Yinko Yu in the center of 4 panels, which represent the 4 gates to 4 worlds. What do you need to unlock a gate? A key. Once the key is obtained, you need to kill or terminate what represents the old to make way for what is soon to be the new. Not to mention that there's also the obscure, messed up minigames where you have to control purple shadow-like deformed figures. You are passing through dimensions, or in other words, worlds. The final puzzle minigame makes you play as a fat rabbit that laughs creepily a lot, and you pass through 4 sectors, which represent the 4 different worlds. The sectors have different designs because they are different worlds. One having a similar spiral, which is now to Chris's Dark Magic Eye, which is the Vortex world. Another world with a pixelated head represents Madmind, which is the Voxeled world. The next one with 4 chests, I didn't have any clue what the 4th world would have been, so I put crates there to represent decisions I had to make to decide on what the world would be, because I had no idea what I wanted that world to be. And the last sector with the noose, which represents Tier TF's world, also known as the Perpendicular world. In other words, life is but a butterfly's dream. Life isn't sugar and rainbows, it's harsh and rough. Once you have completed the minigame, you enter a graveyard with a strange voice telling you about waking up from the lucid dreams. It's talking about the past is now dead, hence the gravestones, and have become nothing but a figment of dreams. Therefore, you need to wake up and see your new reality, because you are now in the new shifted reality / timeline. And because of the implementation of the character Yinko Yu, the game was later cancelled with no actual real explanation other than, and I quote, "My therapist suggested I end the series and venture into new projects," end quote, which I'll get to that at a later point in the video. Back to what I was saying, it was cancelled with no real explanation. It's because Tier T5 now no longer exists. It's dead in the old reality, and it's time for a brighter future with good and much needed changes ahead. But people were obsessed and wanted to bring back what was never meant to be. A lot of projects took inspiration from it, and some attempted to recreate it. This was my attempt at rebooting the franchise in a fun ARG type way that can feel like a journey once the dust settles. The Road That Falls releasing and looking back to see how far the franchise's death and rebirth have come by turning it into an ARG with Volume 2. One gigantic game, playing with people's heads, solving interactive social media clues, creating an alt account specifically for a character to take control of a series and give it new life. Oh, that's a mouthful. A few months later, in June of 2016, I was falsely accused by the person I worked with on Frankfurt's of being related to my first girlfriend, which was an attempt to destroy my reputation. And it worked, I'll give them that. Most of everyone believed it because it's the internet. Anybody will believe almost anything just because somebody said it was true, even though I was born and raised in Texas of the US and she was born and raised in the UK and England. How that makes sense is beyond me, but people somehow believed it. After countlessly trying to defend myself and prove my innocence, I broke up with my first girlfriend because I wasn't happy with it. I was forcing myself into a sexuality that both didn't make me happy nor was it really me. It was toxic and manipulative. I cried almost every day during the relationship because of my depression growing during it and way before that. Plus, the situation I was dealing with at the time didn't with being falsely accused and overall hating myself for forcing myself to be the person I was. After the breakup, all was silent for a while. I still had contact with my friends that believed me, and it took me almost an entire year to get my reputation back to the way it was. Almost. About 95% of people finally realized it was all BS to ruin me, and about 5% still have their heads buried deep, still believing in something that doesn't make any sense in any way, shape, or form. A month later in July, I finally snapped and came out as gay and explained that who I was before wasn't really me. It was me trying to and forcing myself to be somebody else I was not. And it was mentally damaging for me to do things I hated, become someone I hated, etc. From there on forward, I stayed true to myself and who I really was inside as a person and staying true to others. Well, except when it came to game development projects and when it came to people asking if I'm okay. Because typically I'd say I'm okay and when I'm really not. And that's the start of a new beginning for me. During these times, I was still trying to redeem myself and prove my innocence from being falsely accused. It wasn't till December of 2016 that 95% of people knew the truth. Yeah, it took that long. Around October of 2016, I released both The Dreadful Truth, which was basically a TRTF book to it was basically my excuse to piece up all of the connections in TRTF 1 through 4 while leaving TRTF 5 out because it never happened in the story because of the huge reality shift. But it was basically my way of basically just piecing everything together. This part isn't scripted. I'm inserting this right now because I forgot to add this in around this time period. Another thing I also released was the End music video, which was another Halloween gift. Basically, it was supposed to be my, and I quote, last TRTF related thing. That was also a lie. In the end saying like, oh, this is the last DLC TRTF by me or stuff, and saying this is the end of TRTF, and then making a contradicting statement saying, but TRTF really isn't over, and then putting in a little hint on a point, I don't know how point millisecond time frame, but if you pause at a certain point right before I talk about the Tigers Mania development progress, there's a thing saying is Lockjaw really gone forever, or is Lockjaw already dead, or something like that. That's basically me hinting towards something that's going to happen in the future eventually, which is what's happening now, obviously. But that's all I want to say. Anyways, back to the script. Around October of 2016, my brother Sean and I then partnered up to start making projects together, and we wanted to continue our gigantic universe that we've been wanting to build up to. So we made a quote-unquote dream list. It's basically a to-do list of projects we want to attempt at creating, hence it being a dream list and not a priority. We had Lucidia, Lucid's new name, because the name is apparently already taken from a game that on Steam that is pretty much an underwater Bejeweled. We had Mad Mine, Project Red Panda, which soon had the name Tigers Mania, and a TRTF reboot called The Road That Falls. That was the beginning. That was our startup for a new reality. Sean came up with the name for the new TRTF, so I'm not claiming, nor will I claim, that I made the new name whatsoever. It's a metaphorical name, however. It's meant to represent a long awaited journey, a road, that the players, the fans, have already been put on, that will eventually tumble and collapse, in other words, fall, in the final chapter of the new series to make way for the next stage/era in the gigantic universal story that is being told. Hence, the name is given. We thought it's pretty cool. On November 3rd of 2016, I got into my second relationship with my first boyfriend. Around February of 2017, Sean and I recruited some people for our second attempt at a dev team, not a company, not yet. We call it Alstrom Productions. We called it that because it was ran by my brother and I, and it didn't tumble into drama like last time, but instead it was just silent, like a lot. It'd be like, "Hey guys, how are you? Oh, we're good. Well, I'll talk to you later," and nothing else. Sometimes a chat wouldn't be used for a week to many weeks, so Sean and I quietly left while it just silently died. Nobody really did anything in the team except Sean and I, pretty much. Around March of 2017, after months and months worth of work Sean and I put into Tico's Mania, and how it was originally going to be the start of what we call now the Gatekeeper universe, it was eventually seen as a supposed quote-unquote Crash ripoff by several people, even though, as I stated in the plans document, the gameplay, story arc, and everything else had nothing to do, nor was it related with Crash at all whatsoever, in any way, shape, or form. The game's art style, however, was heavily inspired by Crash, along with the 3ds Max experimental renders that had nothing to do with the game at all. They were just test renders to test out, see how the characters look in certain poses, and how it looks like in the final product once it's rendered. But the only thing that the group of people had against the game being supposedly a Crash ripoff was experimental renders that had nothing to do with the game. I understand why they would misunderstand it as a ripoff, though, but it's come to the point that I realized it was only witch hunt after countlessly explaining to read the plans document folder to see the evidence that nowhere in the game's plans is it related to Crash, even though they still used the same dumb stuck-up excuse to believe otherwise. Eventually, around May of 2017, Sean and I pushed Tico's Mania aside for another time. It wasn't because we canceled it, because we never did. It was because we needed a much better game engine to appropriately fitting enough for our needs to make a game that isn't solely targeted towards high-end users like Unreal Engine 4 was. We didn't want low-end users to feel left out with horribly crappy pixelated and terrible graphics while still struggling to have stable frame rates. But instead, we wanted low-end users to have what I call beautifully simple graphics that run stable enough on low-end users, while high-end users can enjoy their own graphics setting too. We want each graphic setting to be set for each user, but feel satisfyingly unique in each way. After we pushed Tico's Mania aside, Sean and I took a long break from game development to solely focus on planning and almost nothing but planning. We planned out what we wanted our future studio to be like, how we wanted things to work, how we seek particularly and pickingly as employees, did research on copyright and trademark laws, took advice from books about entrepreneurs, and even my mother, since she owns and runs a business of her own called Unilum Spa, learned how to maintain a business smoothly and efficiently, learned how to avoid illegal trouble when it comes to anything business related, etc. And I've learned a lot to prepare myself for when I turn 18, to fully fulfill my long-awaited dream of running my own official registered game studio. And during those months of me being away from game development, I've been also drawing comics and writing a book called Between the 16 Years in my spare time. Stuff I never got around to finishing, even to this day. I'll finish them up one day eventually, when I come around to it. Around August of 720, around August of 2017, Sean and I were ready to take our first project that will start up the new universe, that is the Gatekeeper universe, called The Road That Falls, or in other words, with its masked name, The Return of Freddy's. Our intention was to put out there that The Return of Freddy's was being rebooted, and we weren't lying. It was announced. It was announced as Operation Bigfoot. It's an inside joke. And we teased our return to game development with a test render full of placeholder textures and different lighting effects and materials. People were wondering what we were up to and what Operation Bigfoot was. There was a lot of theories that it was Tier TF 5 or a different Tier TF sequel. Very few theories that it was an entirely new Tier TF game, and quite a few that thought it was just an entirely new game in general. A month later, around September, I released a teaser image of a styled Fredbear head, and it immediately confirmed that it was a Tier TF related game. Kind of. It was more or less the ending era of the one giant ruse. Sean and I wanted to make it as believable as possible that such a game would even exist even though I've insisted time and time again after Tier Tier 5 cancellation that I wouldn't go back to FNAF fan games. You'd think by now people would find this a bit suspicious and put this into consideration, but people believed it anyways. We put a lot of time and efforts into pointless rooms, animatronic models, website source code messages, and tweets to make sure that it genuinely felt like a new Tier TF game was happening, and it worked a little too well than we originally thought. And even if making all these things were pointless, it was honestly very well worth it. I say this because it has not only helped with the ruse, but it also helped me be more experienced at modeling, using different techniques with modeling and so on and so forth, like I did with the decoy animatronic models. It has definitely taught me a lot, and it was a lot of fun making it. So, to me at least, it was not pointless. A couple months later, on November of 2017, my first boyfriend dumped me. His reasoning for it was because I was sensitive and always worried a lot, and that I was clingy and whiny because of venting, even though he vented literally every day too. And then complains in public, spreading BS to make the situation look worse than it really was. So, I'm sorry for being human and showing affection, I guess? Maybe I should just shut all my toxins in my chest and no longer express my emotions to someone I trust the most, and no longer express my love when it comes to relationships. If you haven't noticed, that was sarcasm, by the way. A month later, around December of 2017, I had my second boyfriend. It only lasted a couple weeks, because after week 2, he said, and I quote, he wasn't attracted to me anymore. Which, I guess, I mean, we were still friends, and he wasn't immature about it even after the breakup. I mean, it didn't really feel like a relationship anyways, because there really wasn't any bondage at all. So even during the breakup, there wasn't any heartbreak. We were still friends, as I said, and he wasn't immature about it after the breakup, but I didn't like the idea that he was seeking a sexual relationship rather than a real relationship where all things are put into consideration and not just sexual activity, because that's not a relationship. During the same month, Sean and I put up our first Q&A video labeled #TRTF Q&A, not #The Return of Freddy's Q&A. Little details like that we leave solely for the purpose of giving hints that it was something more than meets the eye. Even taking older stuff from 2016 into consideration too. We've made it clear in the video that we had special plans for Lockjaw, but he wasn't what people think he is. We've also made it clear that I wanted TRTF to be TRTF and not FNAF, even though the teasers I put out there were very contradicting to that statement, which we thought people would notice that detail, but apparently not. I stated that this was being not a remake or a remaster, but a reboot. A reboot implies that the said person takes what has already been created and makes it into something else, which is what The Road That Falls is. A genuine tier TF reboot, thanks to the timeline/reality shift. Taking what is already created and twisting it on its head and making something completely different out of it. What people were expecting or wanting to believe is that it was a remake of The Return to Freddy's without fully understanding the concept of what a reboot is. And I've lied to almost everybody about the project that was being worked on behind the curtain around that time period and before that. People would ask, "What are you working on?" And I'd always reply with The Return to Freddy's at that time. Around March of 2018, I put up a cryptic message on Instagram of a chalky white sand particle looking hand with a familiar eye in the center, the same exact eye I used for the Ulstrom Productions logo back in 2016 to 2017, saying that a lot of planning and work has been done, but didn't state clearly exactly what has been done, which is the point, is to keep it a surprise and a secret. People were suspecting that it was either Allison's gang symbol or a crosshair icon. Once again, another thing that was overlooked. During the same month, my cousin Josh tagged along for the development of Korea Studios. Sean, Josh, and I only hired people we knew would work together as a team, stay productive, think outside of the box with an expressive, strange, and open imagination, no matter how weird or absurd it is, and have similar mindsets. So during the same month of March, we hired Obscurity. 2 months later, of May of 2018, Korea Studios was legally registered as a game company. I was prepared and ready to take on this responsibility. During that same time it was announced, the company and I hired fire, and we all felt proud. And we were all very, very happy with how far we've come, and how far we've worked, and how hard we've worked to accomplish this long life goal. As months went by, from May through August, we had business calls every now and then, pitched ideas to each other, helped grow the Gatekeeper universe larger and larger, and I even sat down with them and explained the beginning and end of the GKU and how everything will play out and how everything will work. Every time we had a new idea for the GKU, we had to go back all the way through the GKU timeline and make sure that the continuities were aligned and that there were as little plot holes as we possibly could. And we had a laundry list of game ideas we wanted to both make happen or experiment with. Around June of 2018, I had my third boyfriend. He was a longtime friend of mine. It was more or less just an experiment for both of us to see how things would work out before locking the relationship together for long term. But after a few weeks, things didn't really work out. But we were still good friends to this day. During that same month, I was also pressured into revealing that TRTF is not a FNAF fan game the entire time, and is all just one big ruse. It divided the fan base, and we expected this to happen, because we knew that it would have mixed reactions. Now, why we expected it and did it anyways, we'll get to that later. But then again, I did spoil them half to death with non-stop The Return to Freddy's content, 8 Tier TFT's games, pushed aside an original game for Tier TF4, constantly felt pressure to make more and more and more, and it had to be put to a stop. And most of them, not all of them, complained about it because they didn't get what they wanted. They expected a remake and not a reboot, like I've stated many times before, and didn't get the hint countlessly contradicting teasers and statements. And even after explaining, some finally understood it, but some still didn't understand after claiming they understood, making them lost. And this is the part where I explain the point the studio and I were trying to make. Now that the ruse of 2016 had finally ended during this month of 2018. Not this month I'm talking now, but the month of June. We live in a world where this generation will literally believe almost anything that is put online, whether they see it or hear it. It's honestly disturbing to think about. From the BS someone pulled, who shall not be named, in 2016, where I was falsely accused, to the Tier TF ruse the studio and I pulled, to someone else's act that happened a month ago in real time, around September of 2018, where they pretended to be me, said a bunch of rude and nasty things in the chat. People in the chat believed it, then revealed it was a joke, and people found out it wasn't actually me. And it's disturbing. We've proven that anybody will believe almost anything online. I say almost anything, not everything, almost anything. And that you have to take information online with a grain of salt until further proof is shown. If the statement is made and there is plenty of proof to back it up, then I believe that there is a right to believe it. But then again, who knows? It's an innocent till proven guilty type scenario. And this is how the studio and I work. You have to take the information the company puts out about a game with a grain of salt. Even though the Tier TF ruse has ended, that doesn't mean there won't be another one in the future, because that's how we work. That's how we market stuff. We make everything in interactive ARG. It's to give it a more immersive experience for the audience. It's all one giant game in interactive ARG. And hopefully now people will know how to play our game that people of all sorts can be a part of. It's a journey for us all. And it'll be cool to look back on. And it wasn't only to prove this point, but also a way for me to finally make what I want. Because every time I'd make a FNAF related project in the past, everybody would run towards it and not complain. But when it came to me making my own game, like my own original project, a game that I want to make, it has always been talked down upon, and people would shit on it, saying this looks like complete garbage, or this is going to fail, watch it, or you can't make this because it's a huge project you've never done before, claiming it's, and I quote, constructive criticism, rather than actually helping and saying, hey, I don't like how this looks. Maybe you could do this, this, and this to improve it. It happened with Teaker's Mania and Madmind, and it's sort of happened with The Road That Falls after I announced it. After I announced it was not what they thought it was. At this point, I've ignored it, but a few months ago, it just bothered me that a lot of people wouldn't give any of my original projects a chance. A chance for me to show what my imagination and creativity is capable of creating. I want to show people a new story out of the characters they already know and love. I want to do something different with Lockjaw stuff. I would have said this in the first place, but then the cycle would just repeat. It would just always be this claim of constructive criticism when they're not actually helping or doing anything. There would be some people who would help, but it will only be very few people. And I appreciate that so much because it really, really helps. But for the most part, it would just people be talking down on it, giving me doubt, and everything. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help us as a studio. and it would be claimed as constructive criticism. There was one time someone commented on the Game Joe page a few months ago saying, I think you're taking this original thing a bit too far. Um, and I thought, well, good. At least they'll stand out rather than trying to be everybody else. I don't want my games to be like everything else. I want to make my games through my weird storytelling. A month later in July, I had my fourth and final boyfriend. And we both have the same birthday, same music interests, both have crazy imaginations, both dig horror movies, both love Star Wars, both have very similar personalities, and we always have each other's backs, look out for one another, make sure we're both okay, taken care of and supported, and we both have coffee addiction and both can relate to each other on so many levels. And the list goes on and on and on and on. But anyways, and I haven't been any happier since. I have my lifelong dream fulfilled and maintained smoothly. I found the love of my life I can share my adventures and love with for long term. And we moved into a new house that we're not struggling with bills on. And overall, I feel like the happiest boy alive. During the month of August, I hired Brime, and it helped a lot that we had another modeler on the team that is very well skilled at it. And he never fails to impress me. From there on forth, the studio and I have stayed very productive, and we work very hard every single day to make sure that work is still getting done, no matter how long it takes or no matter what the condition of the situation is. Whether we have a computer or not, we're always working every single day. Because we're passionate about what we do. Sean is helping with The Road That Falls and working on his own studio game. Obscurity is working on his own studio game while I'm helping. Brime is helping Fire and I with our games. Fire is working on his own studio game while helping me with my game. And Josh is working on his own studio game with my help as well, even to this day. And things have been great ever since, and I could not be any happier. This pretty much sums it up, my entire life story, as short as I possibly could. This video is probably almost an hour long. I can't see the timestamp right now, so I try to leave all the boring stuff out as much as possible with the script. So obviously a lot has been skipped over. The My Life video, GKU Explained video, and the Ruse Formation video was all originally going to be separate, but I went back and re-edited the script and just went ahead and just inserted things in a timeline order while I'm talking through my life's experiences and through day one to right now. And I decided it'd be best if I just throw everything in just one video rather than it just being multiple, because I think that would be too much work on my shoulders and it would be too unnecessary. I hope this all makes sense now, and I hope you all get the gist of everything and why it happened, and I'm never doing this kind of video again.